Okay, I think we are good to begin, and especially so given a very strong turnout on a cold evening in February. Good evening to each of you and to everyone. It's nice to see many familiar faces and to note that we have some folks joining us who may not be members of our congregation. So a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar on the recent Israeli election, which is presented by Congregation Darchei Noam in Toronto. I'm Myer Siemiatycki. I'll be moderating tonight's program. And for starters, a big thank you to Judy Howard, who is at the controls hosting this session. And again, thanks to each and every one of you for joining us for what I know will be an informative and thoughtful discussion. Let me start things off by quickly reviewing the plan for the evening in terms of both its content and its format. Tonight, our focus is on the recent Israeli election, its new government, and what we might expect going forward. I imagine that in recent weeks and days, we have all been following events in Israel with renewed attention, care, and concern. Something all analysts of Israel seem to agree on is that November's election has opened a new chapter in Israeli politics and government. So tonight we have asked 3 DN members, all longtime and thoughtful observers of Israeli politics, to share their analysis of the Israeli election and its implications. Let me introduce them in the order they will each present. First up is Sid Nestel, a longtime member of Darchei Noam. Before that, he lived in Israel for 15 years, and Sid served in the IDF while there. Sid notes that he has followed Israeli politics and the Israel-Palestine conflict somewhat obsessively, he says, for the past 55 years at least. After Sid, we'll hear from Shirley Segev, also a longtime DN member. Shirley follows life in Israel very closely in the Hebrew media, with a focus on Israeli politics, but her interests expand to all aspects of Israeli life. Many of us have attended previous shul presentations that Shirley has made on past Israeli elections and events. And our final presenter will be Renan Levine, a more recent vintage next generation DN shul member. Renan teaches political science at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. He has published academic research on Israeli voting behavior and public opinion, and has occasionally written commentary on Israeli elections for the Canadian Jewish News. So I think you can see we have an all-star lineup ready to give us their interpretations and analysis of the Israeli election. As for their discussion topics, Sid will focus on the election results. Shirley will assess the personalities and policies behind the new government, and Renan will probe Israeli public opinion, the issues that mattered most to Israelis at the polls, and how Israelis now feel about the new government. Our timelines for this evening are as follows. The presenters will speak for 10 to 12 minutes each. After that, we will have a brief 10-minute looking ahead segment where they identify key issues they expect to arise in the period ahead. After the presenters have finished, we will have a Q&A period of 30 to 45 minutes. And there are 2 ways that you'll be able to pose a question. First, you can send me your question through the chat function and I will pose it to the speakers. If your question is intended for a specific presenter, please specify whom. Or secondly, you can pose your question or a comment yourself by going to the reaction tab below and clicking the raise hand icon, and you'll be called upon. I would ask those choosing this second option to be brief so that we can get in as many questions and questioners as possible this evening. We expect the webinar to conclude at around 8:30. And just before we get going, a final quick future events promo from me. Tonight's program is the first in a series on engaging with Israel post-election. Mark the date, March 4th on your calendar. That's 4 weeks from tonight. That's when our next webinar features Professor Derek Pensler of Oxford and University of Toronto, speaking on the subject of Israel-Jewish diaspora relations. If there are other topics that you would suggest we consider for the subject of future webinars, you can let us know by messaging the Shul office, and the best way to do that is to email Claire, C-L-A-I-R-E, at darchenoam, all one word, .ca. So much for my getting in the way of who you really came to hear, the three presenters. And so we're now ready for them. So Sid, I would call on you to get us going. Sid Nestel.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. I'm going to share my screen. And I hope you can all see that. Somebody want to nod to tell me you can see it? Yeah, okay. So let me just put this into full screen mode. There, can you still see it, Mayor? Got a nod? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so as we said, I'm going to talk about focus on the elections themselves. So surprise, if you haven't been following the news, the Netanyahu coalition won and defeated the outgoing coalition headed by Naftali Bennett, and later on by, of course, I'm having a senior's moment, the head of Yesh Atid, Lapid. Who their coalition lost. So on this chart, the part at the top, coded dark blue, are the new incoming coalition, made up of 4 parties. The Likud party, it's basically a secular right-wing party, although they have been getting more and more religious over the years. About a third of their members wear kippot at this point, of their elected members. The surprise of the election, the Religious Zionism, Otzma Yehudit, and Noam coalition, which ran under the banner of Religious Zionism, but is actually 3 parties, a 3-party sort of joint list. Shas, the Sephardi religious party, ultra-Orthodox party, and United Torah Judaism, the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party. And they together make up the new coalition. So you have a coalition of a right-wing secular party, maybe secular, semi-religious, although the leadership is not religious, and 3 openly religious parties. And then you have the opposition, so to speak. The ones coded in light blue are the outgoing coalition. And then you have in yellow 2 parties that are not part of, were not part of either bloc. They're certainly anti-Netanyahu, but they, because they're Arab parties, probably, anyway, they could not come to any agreement to join the outgoing coalition, and probably, even if the coalition had a few more votes, they wouldn't have been able to come to such an agreement. Some characteristics of the new situation: 40 of the 64 coalition members are Orthodox, and 24 of the 64 coalition members are themselves settlers. So this is a coalition that is religious, right-wing, and not only pro-settler, but is itself, 1/3 or 40% made up of settlers. And by settlers, I mean people living in settlements in the West Bank itself. The number of women is 32, which is down only slightly from 36 in the previous coalition. But the number in the government, or in the coalition itself, so 32 is the number in the Knesset in general, so a slight drop in women representation in the Knesset, but the number in the government itself is only 6 of 64 of the government members are women, and that compares to 26 out of 56 in the opposition. And this is what you'd expect given the dominance of religious parties in the coalition. Shas and United Torah Judaism do not allow women to run on their slates, and religious Zionism, so the other party does, but they have very few women in it, and so does Likud, but they just happen to have very few women in it. One of the features of the election was the overall turnout was 71%, which is up from the previous election. The Jewish turnout was 76%, and the Arab turnout was 53%. And that's, again, typical. The Arab turnout is always lower than the Jewish turnout, but the Arab turnout was up quite a bit from the previous election. And so was the Jewish turnout, but the Arab turnout was up even more than the previous election. Although it didn't help defeat the Netanyahu coalition. Some other things to note here. Well, as I've said, the split is not only between right and left, it is even more so between secular and religious. Virtually none of, I think, in the blue column there, except for the United Arab List, which are religious Muslims, I think there are two, if I'm not mistaken, people who wear kippot among the Jewish opposition members. And as I said, there are 40 out of 64 in the coalition. And by kippot, I'm saying that as includes women, of course, who would cover their hair. So some of them are religious women. Again, in terms of shifts, you'll notice that the big gain was the Religious Zionism Party that gained 8 seats from the previous election, and that alone would explain the shift from one coalition to another. But the Likud also went up by 2, and Shas surprised everyone. No one expected them to gain, but they also gained 2 seats. And the Yesh Atid party, which was the primary opposition party, also gained, but they gained, unfortunately, at the expense of their own coalition partners. So it didn't really increase their bloc's success. You'll notice that the big losers on the left, so to speak, were the Israeli Labor Party, which lost 3 seats. Probably all of them went to Yesh Atid. Meretz, which lost 6 seats, primarily because it fell below the election threshold. If you get less than 4 seats, the equivalent of 4 seats, 3.25%, you get 0 according to the rules. So they missed that by a few thousand votes, literally 2,000 or 3,000 votes. They got 3.16%. So they would have had 4 seats if they would have gotten just slightly more votes. The other big loser is the Jewish Home Party, which in the previous government was really called the Yamina Party. So the Yamina Party collapsed. That was the party of Naftali Bennett and his partner, Ayelet Shaked. Bennett retired from politics. Shaked joined this other faction called Jewish Home, but they lost all their seats. They were completely discredited because their right-wing voters were angry at them for forming a coalition with the left, and in particular with including an Arab party. So they really got punished this time around, and all those seats went somewhere to the, most of them, we don't know exactly, but most of them probably went to the Religious Zionism Party. Some of them may have stayed in the opposition bloc in National Unity or Yesh Atid. We don't know exactly. And then we have the 2 Arab parties, Hadash Tal, which got pretty much the same as it got last time, and Balad, which split off from this Hadash Tal combination. It used to be called the Joint List, and everyone thought that would make Hadash Tal lose seats. It didn't, because the Arabs turned out in high votes. And Balad also almost got into the Knesset. I mean, maybe 10 or 20,000 votes short. Surprised everyone they did that well. And Balad is the sort of most extreme nationalist party among the Arabs, the Israeli Arabs. So that's sort of the facts. You'll notice some other things. People have said, "Oh, it wasn't really a victory for the right. If only Meretz had gotten over the threshold. If only Yesh Atid hadn't cannibalized the votes on the left, and Meretz had gotten over the threshold." Well, if Meretz had gotten over the threshold, they would have gotten 4 more seats, but those 4 seats wouldn't have all gone coalition, because the 4 seats have to come from somewhere. And doing an analysis, half of them would have come from the coalition and half of them would have come from the opposition. So the score would have been 62-58 if Meretz had, in fact, gotten over the line. So this is a loss. A loss is a loss. What can you say? You'll notice that the coalition did not get more than half the votes. They only got 48% of the votes. But the opposition is completely fragmented. And you've got this 6.6% down here, which are the Arab votes, which the Jewish opposition can't figure out how to work with, and they can't figure out how to work with the Jewish opposition. So that those are sort of lost to opposing Netanyahu. Okay. Just going to briefly show you this slide. So here I've reordered the same data. I've just reordered it, and people like to talk about right and left in Israel, and right and left in Israel is mostly around the relationship with Palestinians and how hawkish you are or dovish you are. So just using the criteria of do you or don't you support a Palestinian state, the two-state solution or something like that, you'll see that essentially the ones in the two top categories either officially oppose a Palestinian state, or Shas and United Torah Judaism, which have no policy because they're religious parties, but de facto they oppose it. They're not going to vote for a Palestinian state or a two-state solution. So that totals 76 seats, or almost 58% of the total vote, which again, because Arabs constitute about 20% of the Israeli electorate, 67% of the Jewish vote voted for parties that oppose a Palestinian state under pretty much any conditions. And then you've got the light blue of people who I would say officially support a two-state solution, but are basically pretty wishy-washy. And it's sort of someday, maybe, if we feel like it, if the conditions are right. Conditions are not right now. And even though it's on paper, they really do nothing to promote a two-state solution or even promote negotiations in that direction. And then you've got this very small group, which is labeled in pink, which are people who are probably serious about the two-state solution, would really push for it if they could, and when they had a little bit of power, or whatever power they had, did push for it, but they amount to less than 10% of the electorate. So and on that level of right and left, it's not even close. Even though the coalition and opposition are close, because they disagree on other issues like secularism versus religion, rule of law, and other issues. On the critical issue of dealing with the Palestinians, it's not even close. The hardliners have a clear majority. I'm going to briefly talk about where the votes came from. So this is a breakdown of the votes. You'll compare here Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. It's like, well, the two opposites, extremes of the Israeli society. Jerusalem, 24% voted for the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi party, 19% for the Likud, 18% for Shas, the ultra-Orthodox Sephardi party. Religious Zionism, which got 11% nationally, and which is, I will say, a proto-fascist party, got 14% in Jerusalem. And then the liberal parties, single digits. Whereas Tel Aviv, you have the liberal centrist party Yesh Atid, leading with 33%. The Likud still does fairly well with 17%. National Unity, sort of a central right party, gets 11%. Meretz, which didn't pass the threshold and got no seats, got 11% in Tel Aviv. Labor, 9%, and then smaller groups after that.
Sid, I'm jumping in just to give you the 2-minute countdown.
Okay. In Haifa, which used to be Red Haifa, the labor bastion, this used to be a city that voted 60-70% for the labor coalition. They had strong unions and workers' councils. You'll see that labor got 5%. If you want to talk about the demise of the Israeli Labor Party and the left in general, you just have to look at Haifa. So Yesh Atid against the centrist liberals get the most. Likud gets almost as much. National Unity, center-right, does pretty well at Haifa, and then farther down the list. And Beersheba, being a southern city, mostly poorer than the other ones, mostly more Sephardi than the other ones, again, votes more right-wing than the other ones. These are just some towns in greater Tel Aviv. You'll notice Ramat HaSharon, which is a northern suburb, extremely liberal, wealthy, liberal, and it votes as you'd think it would. Yesh Atid, the centrist party, gets 42%. Meretz gets 9%, which is, again, 3 times as much as it did nationally. But then you look at a city like Petah Tikva, which is a working class suburb, or Holon, which is even a slightly poorer suburb, and you see that the right does much better. Likud, Yesh Atid does reasonably well, the centrist party. Religious Zionism gets 14%, above its national average in Petah Tikva, a working class suburb of, or a middle class suburb, I wouldn't say working class suburb of Tel Aviv. This is an interesting thing, the mixed cities. If you remember, there were riots, intercommunal riots between Arabs and Jews about a year and a half ago in Lod and in Acre. And Lod in particular is fascinating. The Likud comes number 1 with 29%. Balad, the extreme Arab nationalist party, the one that wants to not cooperate with the Zionist parties, gets 16%. And religious Zionism, the basically Jewish fascists, get 16%. So the cities where there was conflict, where there was violence, we see them polarizing, perhaps not surprisingly. Akko is similar, though not as extreme. The West Bank settlements. Efrat, a town mostly populated by American Olim, fairly well off, middle class, 48% for religious Zionism, for what, again, I'm going to call a proto-fascist party. The head of the party says that he's a fascist. Ariel, a town which is much less ideological. People moved there for economic reasons mostly, but a city within the West Bank, 41% Likud, 20% religious Zionism, 14% Yisrael Beitenu, that's Russian immigrants who've moved there. It's primarily a Russian party. And then we get the liberal parties with, you know, the dregs. And Beitar Elite, this is interesting. This is an ultra-Orthodox city in the West Bank. As you'd expect, the 2 ultra-Orthodox party get most of the vote, but religious Zionism steals 8% of the vote. These are people who vote the way their rabbis tell them, for the most part, but 8% didn't and voted for the religious Zionism party. And finally, the development towns. Again, what you'd expect. Dimona is typical of the development towns, overwhelmingly Likud. This has been the bedrock of the Likud for 50 years or more, are these development towns. Small cities, but together they add up to quite a bit. 61% for the Likud, 16% for religious Zionism, and there from there. Rahat is a Bedouin city. This is the base of the moderate conservative religious Arab list among the Bedouins, and they get 64% in that Bedouin city. And Afikim, this is the 2nd or 3rd largest kibbutz in the country. And again, this used to be labor and Meretz, 1 and 2. In the 1990s, this would have been, you know, 50% labor, 25% Meretz, and going down from there. And now Yesh Atid, the centrist party, gets most of it. Labor still does well, but it comes in 2nd, and down from there. So that's what I have to say, and I'll let it go to the next speaker.
Sid, thank you very much for giving us such an interesting and strong start to our evening's discussion. I sensed a lot of interest among participants in your numbers, and so I did give you some additional time, which I'll bear in mind with our 2 following speakers. So next up is Shirley Segev. Shirley, over to you.
Yes. So I'm assuming everybody can see the screen. Welcome to the new Israeli government. Sorry. This picture was taken on the 29th of December, 2022. It's the formal presentation of the Israeli government to the President of Israel, Yitzhak Herzog, that is sitting beside Netanyahu. So here's Netanyahu and his government of about 30 showing up, and then there were 2 more, his major ministers behind him, and then all his other members of the coalition that basically Sid presented. Very few women. Basically, it should have been a stable coalition because they are fairly religious and know each other on the left, as well as in the past, they were basically interested in getting money and budget, but surprise, surprise, you are going to see some activist, religious, extreme partners that are giving Netanyahu quite a fight. And what the last thing that's missing here beside Netanyahu, there's usually a chair with the Attorney General who is not here for major reasons. It's in the news now. There's not a lot of love lost between them. I just put this up to show you the 30 members of, and you have garden variety ministers here, basically tourism, transportation, agriculture, energy, and so on. But you have some ministers that are more important. And very interestingly, how Netanyahu built this, to the senior ones, he gave sometimes more than one portfolio, and then he gave the others some junior portfolios as well. So he really created tension here very interestingly, and as well as you will see the important ones and what that means. So can everybody see all of it? For some reason, I can't. Okay, I moved it up. So first, I'm going to present to you the major member of the coalition, which is the Likud that got the 31. And I'm only showing you here the 3 most important ministers, because these are the 3 most important things that are going on in this government. First one is justice, the second defense and education. Education, you say, really, is that important? Yes, it is. So the first one is Yariv Levine. He is in the spotlight these days because he is in charge of the legal transformation and upheaval that he has planned for 20 years. And finally, as he acknowledged, is the time has come that Netanyahu agreed to this, because in the past he didn't want it. And now also the members of the coalition on the right are very eager to go along. So it's kind of, you can call it the perfect timing or the perfect storm. The second one, Yoav Gallant, is the defense minister. He was the chief of staff. He's the most stable of all in the coalition, and Netanyahu needs him because he has carved out part of the defense portfolio to his activist coalition partners, and he needs Yoav Gallant to be a very firm head of defense, and a lot is happening in that area. And the third one is education, and you'll see when I show you the others and how much they are encroaching on Yoav Kish's education portfolio. So this is what we're talking about, the 3 main priorities of the Likud. The second one, and this is an amazing picture, I saw it live. This is Shas, the religious Fardi Mizrahi party, and headed by Aryeh Deri. And in this picture, Netanyahu is showing him the letter of firing him from government just a couple of years after he got to be Minister of Health, Interior, 2 other welfare and religious services. And that is because the Supreme Court ordered Netanyahu to fire him because Aryeh Deri was indicted on financial improprieties in the past, and he's not allowed by law to be and he also swore that in a plea bargain that he will never run again, but he ran, and now the government said absolutely, I'm sorry, the Supreme Court said no, and Netanyahu listened and let him go. But he invited him as an advisor to ministries, and now there's a petition that this is not okay. I won't go into it. Very juicy stuff. The third one is Jewish Power. Itamar, the Star Ben-Gvir, Minister of National Security, taking part of Yoav Gallant's responsibility. He got the police 100%. He got the border security and also the ability to create a new militia with also volunteers. And he is extremely adamant and uniquely, many people in Israel wouldn't believe that he is in the government today. It's like, my God. Anyway, he also has Amichai Eliyahu on heritage, and it's about extreme heritage. And then Yitzhak Wasserlaut and Negev and the Galil, because there's a huge Arab population there, and the idea is to strengthen Jewish identity. The third party, there's 6 in total. I'll go as fast as I can so that we have time for talking. Religious Zionism, Hatzionut Hadatit, Bezalel Smotrich, as described. He took away the ability of Netanyahu to form a government last time because he wouldn't go with an Arab party. And this time, the stars aligned. He got the hugely important Ministry of Finance and Territory Civil Administration, which means making it easier for settlers to get civil services that right now they would get from the army. And then he has absorption and aliyah, which is who is a Jew, and Orit Strak, who I heard speak for half an hour today, National Mission. She got carved out quite a budget from the Education Ministry and to support Jewish heritage and education. Next, Avi Maoz, he got the Deputy Ministry of Jewish Identity. Again, what kind of Jewish identity? Religious, right extremist. He is very much anti-LGBT. And let's go to the last but not least, United Torah Judaism. These are the Ashkenazi Haredi. They were for the longest time with all the governments, very stable, as long as they got their budget for the religious Haredi population. They were happy. A new one, Yitzhak Goldknopf, got housing, very important because the Haredi population is growing by leaps and bounds with 10 kids per family. Moshe Gafni is not a minister, but he's more important than any minister. He's head of the Treasury Committee, and he, for many years, is very experienced. Okay, done with the governments and their agenda. The next
Shirley, it's Myer jumping in with a 2-minute countdown.
Okay, so I'm going, you will see it. So coalition agreements, motherhood and apple pie. This is how they look on the website. Just to tell you what in expanding Jewish religious identity through education, media, cultures, religious institutions, public sphere regulations, prioritization of West Bank, Judea, and Samaria expansion, army police enforcement responsibility run by extreme right, rapid legislative reform to weaken the judiciary autonomy. So everybody talks about the judiciary. What's the problem? They want, thank you to Canada, the overriding, which we call notwithstanding Supreme Court decisions with a simple 61 majority. The government will appoint the judges to the Supreme Court. The Attorney General is supposed to function as subservient to the Knesset and to the government itself. and abolishing the reasonableness judiciary clause option. Very important for Darian. So this is my last one. So this is the senior judge of the Canadian Supreme Court, Rosalind, what is her name? I can't see it. Rosalie Abella, and she said, when an independent judiciary is under siege, democracy is under siege. And when democracy is under siege, a country's soul is being held under siege. And all of that turmoil going on in Israel now is because of this judiciary revolution or transformation or whatever you want to call it.
Shirley, bravo for squeezing all that into 12 minutes. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And you can see Renan Levine getting his slides organized. And so Renan, anytime you're good to go, over to you.
Thank you. Give me 1 second. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Want to add a little bit. I'm going to, by necessity, since I'm going third, repeat a little bit about what was said before, but hopefully with a slightly different take or direction. First, how did the election turn out? If we break down the responses by where they identified, left to right, you can see that if you're on the right, not everyone, but by and large, most were quite happy, and the left thinks it's a disaster, and the center, as you might expect, somewhere in between. Again, not surprising given what Shirley and Sydney have described, that this is a narrow right-wing coalition. And so, yes, people on the right think that this is great news. I want to take a second, though, to step back and say, wait a second here. This was a last in a series of elections. I mean, there's 5 elections in a short amount of time. What was going on? And the reason this question is, I think, worth taking a quick step back on is because it illustrates really fundamental dynamics going on in current Israeli politics. And it's starting with that it's very difficult to form a governing coalition without Benjamin Netanyahu's party, the Likud. The Likud under Netanyahu could not form a stable coalition despite winning more than 50% of the vote in April 2019, largely because of 3 reasons. One, the reluctance of the center left to join Netanyahu while Netanyahu was under indictment or on trial, the opposition of some right-wing or nationalist voters to support a Netanyahu-led coalition while Netanyahu was under indictment or on trial, and finally, a lack of coordination among right religious voters, which caused some votes to be wasted, right, for parties that didn't cross the threshold. Sydney described the dynamics in the very last of these elections, where this lack of coordination hurt the left. The flip side of that is that coordination problem was solved on the right in 2022, and that enabled Netanyahu to form a government without these parties collectively winning greater than 50% of the vote. So it's really quite striking. We had this period of time with period of significant instability in Israeli politics. And in that time, even though the headlines absolutely are, as Sydney put it, the election was won by the right actually lost votes collectively as a percentage of the total one. But they were more efficient in how those votes essentially counted. I don't want to assume that everyone knows how Israelis vote, so I'm just going to take a moment to describe it, that the entire country is one district, and in that one district, you vote for a party, and then you count the total number of votes cast for each party, you find then the percentage of the total vote, and then you allocate the seats in the Knesset based on that percentage. So if a party wins 15% of the vote, the party will receive about 15% of the seats. If the party wins at least 3.25% of the vote, as Sydney mentioned. If you win less than that, you're eliminated. 10 party lists won seats in 2022. Sydney went through that long list of them and noted that several of these lists are in fact coalitions of smaller independent parties. When I presented something similar to this to school children and on campus, they appreciated this illustration since, of course, those of you who are legal to vote here in Canada recently voted in a federal election. It's worthwhile to say, well, okay, if Canada followed Israel's example to have this entire country operating under PR, what would have happened? Well, 2021, the Liberal Party won 160 seats. Under PR, they would have won 110. The Conservative Party actually won more votes than the Liberals did in this last election. They would have had about the same number. The NDP would have had a significant boost. The Bloc Québécois would have lost some support. The People's Party would have won quite a bit, and the Greens would have won more than the two that they had won. I highlight this because these dynamics of the hypothetical of what might have happened in Canada, I think help us understand the election dynamics in Israel, right? I mean, looking at a situation where we can just sort of dismiss Bernier and the People's Party as this, fringe extremist group. 5% of the vote, almost 5% of the seats. That means that this fringe extremist group would be running around with 17 MPs. Right? The NDP would have had 60. That's, again, reflecting their share of the vote, just over half of what each the Liberal and the Conservatives would have. But of course, let's remember there's a threshold. So the Green Party actually would have been eliminated. And then what happens in Israel is that the larger of the parties then pick up the remainder seats. And that's one reason why the Likud and others in that coalition were able to get those key seats to go well over the majority number. Okay, so that comparison aside, hopefully illustrating that, yes, this is an electoral system that, first of all, doesn't create a decisive win. One of my colleagues in the Department of Political Science shows that the Liberal Party in this last election, is doing some research, was very efficient at spending their money in ridings that were crucially competitive. Absent the ability to do that and get a bounce from winning in a geographic area, you're going to have a situation where the largest parties, at least in theory, are still the largest parties. But notice, since there's no party that has a majority coalition, sure, the Liberals and the NDP could still form a coalition, but there would be other options and other alternatives. And that's largely the dynamics we saw over the last few years and has now been resolved, at least for now, with a very solid majority right religious coalition that Sydney and Shirley described. I want to focus, though, on Netanyahu, right? A really key figure, right? If I talk about, the reason why there wasn't a stable coalition was he's under indictment and then on trial for several corruption allegations and being investigated for at least one other, I believe. How this period started when he was elected in this latest round, his latest incarnation, 2009. The median Israeli put him on a scale of 0 to 10 at 5, right in the middle. 25% of Israelis rated him a 3 on that scale. The 75th percentile was a 7. 13 years later, right, when briefly for a year, Netanyahu was replaced as prime minister, what had happened, right? That 25th percentile had shifted over. They now hate him, right? Almost 30% of all Israelis, when asked to rate the incumbent prime minister, rated him a 0 on a scale of 0 to 10. And only about 25% rated him an 8, a 9, or a 10. That actually does compare pretty favorably to some other political leaders you know and possibly love, like Trudeau or Biden. But the Israeli dynamics, of course, means that, as we look at these numbers and say, wait a second here. So as Netanyahu governed, more and more people really hated him. A few more people loved him. Netanyahu's electoral calculations really allow him to focus on those that love him, right? The Likud gets around 20, 25, 30% of the vote. So it's that small group that rates Netanyahu with a lot of love. How does that look graphically? Here it is. You can see that, very divided Israeli electorate with that group loving. You can see there on the right. Now, 14% love him, and a few just short of really loving him, and then about 7-8% rate him an 8. And then there's a few that are like, yeah, Netanyahu, and then this large group that really, really hate him. And so one might think, and I showed this to my class at UTSC, and I'm like, are you a little surprised that this is, the person who has now been prime minister longer than anyone else in Israel's history and is now back in power? I'm like, well, yes, of course. Well, but of course, opinion is always relative. Who is Netanyahu running against? Sorry, there we go. Two of his main rivals, Lapid of Yesh Atid and Bennett. Sydney talked about both of them. You will notice that Lapid in gray is hated just as much or almost as much as Netanyahu by some people. And Bennett, what can be said about Bennett is people don't hate him, but also look at the right side of the graph. Not very many people love him. And certainly not that many people love Lapid, right? I mean, Bennett sort of succeeds or did succeed in March 2021. This is from a year ago, because, people didn't hate Bennett the same way. Not exactly, though, a stirring endorsement of his leadership. And as Sydney and Shirley mentioned, it did get worse, especially among his key supporters, which there weren't very many of them to begin with. So why is this important? This is important because Netanyahu and the Likud are not looking for votes across the ideological spectrum. They have an advantage in that there is a relatively large, but objectively mid-sized group of voters in Israel that strongly supports the party / Netanyahu. And Sydney described the geography of a lot of that, right? And so forming a stable government without those 20 to 30% of the electorate is going to be tricky. Who are they? And I'm going to lean on data which I have a bit better than the data I have from the latest elections, and you have a whole bunch of elections over a few years. A year old shouldn't be that much different than what we have in 2022. 45% rate themselves as traditional, one of two categories. So that's not really religious beyond like lighting candles on Friday night, saying Kiddush. So that's really the Likud base, with a third identifying themselves as either religious, Hardal, the national religious, the knitted yarmulke people, or indeed Haredi. 2/3 of these supporters of Netanyahu and Likud think that Israel's situation is good or very good, which is about double it is for the others. So these are people who, think things are good, which again shouldn't be too surprising. The man's, this is reflecting the supporters of the incumbent government for 13 years. And again, 2/3 desired the coalition that indeed formed in late 2022. So these are not voters that, even though they're in that center right, who are saying, geez, we really wish Netanyahu pivoted towards the middle.
Renan Myer here, alerting you to a 2-minute countdown.
Excellent. 75% of them oppose the establishment of a Palestinian state. 40% believe that public life should definitely be according to Jewish tradition. 20% say perhaps, whatever that means. Peace and security played more of a role in their vote choice compared to other voters. Corruption and democracy, less of a role. Again, shouldn't be too surprising given that they are supporting Netanyahu. And they are crucially, because the Israeli electorate, one reason why there's been such a shift towards the center over the last 20 years or so is a great sense of cynicism in the Israeli electorate. These voters tend to be more optimistic about Israeli security than their neighbors. Notable, though, is that some, but not all, of the current coalition's promised policies are very popular among supporters of the coalition. Popular ones that I rate as more than 70% of voters for the government party's favor include recognizing some of the young settlements. These are settlements that exist but don't have legal recognition. And little things allow ministers to appoint their own legal advisors. Ones that they don't support is rejecting reform conversions, allowing gendered separation, and benefits to Kollel students. So these are married religious students, and this is one of the key factors in the coalition bargaining, was to give those married yeshiva students more of a subsidy. The big question is, will support for these policies and the coalition grow? In other countries, when key government proposals are not very popular, including among government voters, the expectation by political scientists like me is that a public opinion will be thermostatic, that the public prefers policies further to the right or left that responds to the new government and quickly starts thinking, wait, this new government is going too far in that direction, right? So they vote for the right, a right-wing government comes in place, and public opinion immediately says, now, wait a second here, we wanted center-right, not far-right. And that tends to kick in under a year, usually just after 6 months. So 8-9 months would be the time when we would expect that public opinion would start raising their eyebrows and saying, wait, this is going too far. And I would rate that as quite likely, given that a lot of these proposals that the government has, that's pulling together this coalition, don't have a lot of support even among their voters. And that's why what Shirley was talking about before with these key ministers, that some of those key ministers are Likud, and really their job is going to be to try to preserve as much sort of centrism as possible while still mollifying their extremist coalition partners. Those extremist coalition partners essentially will have a choice to moderate themselves and be responsible adults in government or not. If they continue to, make extremist pronouncements, they'll find themselves more and more on the fringes and not part of the government decision making. But
Renan, you're into your final seconds.
Yep, this is the last line. Unlike past years, it will be hard for Netanyahu to tack to the center if centrist parties will not join a coalition led by him. So in years past, people like Smotrich have moderated themselves while they're in office, but Netanyahu may not have that leverage against him because the Israeli electorate is so divided. Thank you.
Thank you, Renan and Shirley and Sydney, for cramming so much into admittedly the limited time that you had available to you, to each of you. You've given us such a rich sense of the dynamics of the election, some of the personalities and main players and parties and underlying policy implications and preferences that were expressed in that election. So in a way, we've been looking backwards to November and to the formation of the new government. We thought it would be important to spend a few minutes, and I'm going to limit this to no more than 10 minutes total, less if possible, to ask each of the presenters to tell us, what are you looking for going forward? What big issues, developments do you see happening? Do you have concerns about? Do you have hopes for going forward. So to get us going in that, total 10 minutes for all three of the presenters. Sydney, please.
Yes, so there are broadly three areas of concern I think everyone's aware of. One is the policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians in the West Bank. One is the judicial reform, the anti-democratic or illiberal judicial reform. And the other one is the demands of the Haredi religious parties to make Israel more religious and get more money for themselves and things like that. And I'm going to say the ones that worry me the most are the first and the last. The judicial reform can be undone, perhaps, by a future government. But this election and the analysis I did of the parties really is if it wasn't dead already, the complete death of the two-state solution. There will be no two-state solution, and it should be obvious. This coalition, the government, for the first time in its government, like the speech from the throne in its document, says the Jewish people have the exclusive and inalienable right to all parts of the land of Israel, and the government will promote increased settlement in yada, 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 Judea and Samaria. So this government is committed to keeping the territory. There will be no Palestinian state. And I don't see that being undone, because it's not just the government, it's also half the opposition that sort of agrees with that position. And the problem with that is that once you say there is no two-state solution, the current situation is more or less permanent, then what is the defense against the charge that Israel is an apartheid state? As I see it, there is none, and that will become more and more obvious. And it'll become more and more uncomfortable. And the danger there is that Israel increasingly loses support among the West, and perhaps even among Jews in the West. And that is a long-term problem for Israel itself, aside from the moral issues involved in that. And the other thing that I think is a long-term problem is the government has completely capitulated to the Haredi parties. They are going to give them more money. They're going to make no demands to put secular subjects into the Haredi education system, which means that these people will continue to be narrow-minded and essentially right-wing, even though they're not ideologically right-wing, but right-wing for other reasons, xenophobic. And they have more children than the other people, and that segment of the population will grow. So those are really long-term problems for Israel.
Sydney, thank you for that. Next up is Renan.
Yeah, I think my last slide sort of shows what I'm looking at, which is to say, Netanyahu is concerned about a particular sliver of the electorate. It's not a small one, but it's not super big. It's an electorate that is part of the electorate that I think would hear some of the concerns that Sydney raises and shrug their shoulders. They are pretty optimistic about Israel's ability, or Netanyahu specifically's ability, to handle problems that are thrown at it from around the world or internally. I hope I don't see too many of those problems. My research tend to focus on public opinion, and it's those dynamics, because Netanyahu will find it very difficult to govern. And I think, especially given what Sydney was just talking about with the Haredi, the last government, the one that was not led by Netanyahu, that I think we'll look back in history with this 1 year of Netanyahu, what's really remarkable is that what held them together for as long as they did was largely their antipathy towards Haredi benefits. And so Netanyahu's going to be in trouble in some of the places that Sydney described if the Haredim do things like eliminate bus service. I think people, especially Russian Olim, will be particularly peeved. And, I think it's always said the next election is always the important one in Israel. In this case, I'll be looking to see where the dynamics are. Thank you.
Renan, thank you. And lastly, with a crystal ball is Shirley. Shirley, over to you.
So I don't have a crystal ball. This year is the 75th birthday of the State of Israel. But there is no great joy in Jerusalem these days. Instead, there's a state of deep anxiety and discord, and I follow very closely most of the time or most of the day. So looking at the arc of history, at first, I'm hearing myself double. Is everybody hearing me double? Okay. So if we look at the arc of history, at first the aim was to save the lives of as many Jews as possible, mainly from the pogroms and the horrific anti-Semitic times in Europe, and the worst, the Shoah. And this was successfully accomplished with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. But then a change in the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel became the military powerhouse of the Middle East, expanding its borders greatly, returning to the historical areas of ancient Israel, with all the emotional significance of the Western Wall, the Kotel, the Hebron, Beit Lechem, Shechem, and others. And it created this euphoria and power and religious fervor, and also a tension. It was no longer about saving lives of Jews, but the tension between the two parts of the identity of Israel, of Jewish and democratic. Should it be more Jewish or more democratic? So the extreme activist right now in the coalition government wants it to shift towards the extreme right. And for example, basically going home 2,000 years ago, if possible, like Smotrich said openly that his objective in the long run is to have a country ruled by religious law, the halakha. So the question is, after 2,000 years, can you go home again and reconstruct it? Pardon me on that word, exactly as it was. So I don't think so. I think we will continue to have this tension between Jewish and democratic. And I think the long arc of, I'm an optimist, the long arc of history says that in the end it will be democratic, but between now and then, there's going to be a lot of tension.
Shirley, thank you. Thank you especially for holding out the prospect of a happy ending as this all unfolds. So we've had three very interesting and thoughtful presentations, a lot for us to think about and respond to, and we are now in the Q&A section. I can report that there are already about 10 questions, very interesting questions in the chat. We have room for more. So a reminder that if you'd like to pose a question, you can send it to me in the chat, or if you wish to speak, and I will be mindful of the timing involved. You can do that by going to the reaction tab below and clicking the raised hand icon. Okay, I'm going to start with two different questions posed to two different people. Sid, a question to you is, why do you characterize one of the political parties in Israel as fascist?
The head of the Religious Zionism Party and the current finance minister, Smotrich, himself called himself a fascist.
Well, self-identification is a path to that designation. Anything else you'd like to add, Sid, about your own assessment of whether that's an self-assessment?
As Shirley said, he's committed to an undemocratic form of government. He wants it the halakha. I mean, so that's sort of, fascist or undemocratic. He's his own religious sort of undemocratic kind of person. His partner, Ben Gvir, until he became part of the government, advocated non-parliamentary violence. he urged his followers to go and attack both Arabs and Israeli soldiers who prevented them from doing what they wanted to do. Well, non-parliamentary violence, extra parliamentary violence is a fascist hallmark. I mean, I don't know what else I have to say.
Thank you for that, Sid. The next question was directed to Shirley, and it's on a point that Renan subsequently identified. So you may both want to speak to this. And again, I'll ask the presenters to be as brief as you can. The birth rate. Does that alter your optimism, Shirley, that the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox have such a higher birth rate than the left supporters in Israel? What's the implication of that?
So just today, while I got the news that the birth rate for the Orthodox is double the birth rate and the population will double. I don't look at that. Yes, there are implications for that. There are huge upheavals in the Orthodox communities. They are changing. Just today, there was, I couldn't believe it, an Orthodox from the settlement is volunteering to help the Bedouin children in the south of Israel, in the Negev, to learn in school. We are not aware in the media of what's happening. Usually things are happening under the, the undercurrents, and then all of a sudden you learn. So the question still remains, who's going to be ahead of whom? And all I'm hoping is that the Orthodox new generations, that all of the old rabbis died, just the last one just did. And you have new generations, you have now a group of new Haredim that are against the reform, the legal reform. A lot going on. I'm gonna stop here. Yes, it doesn't look good.
Renan, would you like to add anything on that?
An Israeli politician a number of years ago in a debate in the Knesset looked at the secular politicians he was arguing with. And he said, I don't understand why you hate these Haredi or religious kids so much. Who do you think are going to be the secular Israelis of the future? Every generation may be different, but the current economic and social dynamics, I mean, clearly these parties are working really hard to try to preserve them. But times change. So I'm really bad at predicting the future, and we'll see what happens. Demographics tend not to be destiny in a lot of countries. But I, will acknowledge what Sydney said, that, if you're doing a really good job of making sure that people can't sort of deal with or welcome sort of external forces, then you may not get the changes that might be normal and natural or even historical.
Thank you, Renan. Or a reminder of the unpredictability of the future. We have two questions related to Palestinians, and so I'll couple them, and anyone who would like to speak to them, go for it. One notes that Palestinians are heavily armed and wonders if there's a Palestinian interest in provoking war, conflict with Israel. The second question is related to Palestinians, is how do you think the current Israeli government intends to integrate Palestinians into the Jewish state? I presume that refers to Palestinian Arab Israelis, but it could, of course, also relate to Palestinians in occupied lands. So anyone who would like to tackle either of those questions? Sydney, I see your hand up. Go for it.
So the first part of the question was, is there a Palestinian interest in provoking an Israeli aggression. I doubt it. I don't think that that's the way they think about it. They think they're already under attack, and they think they're fighting back. I did see a poll recently which says that 40% of Palestinians support the armed struggle. Well, I guess 60% don't, so it's a glass half full or a glass half empty sort of statement. But that number has risen dramatically in the last 2 years. It was like 30% 2 years ago. So things change under the influence of events. You know, I think right now, yes, I think there's a lot of Palestinians who would like to, you know, take a pot shot at some Israeli. Again, they don't view it as provoking a struggle. They view it as they're already being attacked every day. How does this current Israeli government view integrating Arabs? I think they don't. I think they don't really care. Maybe some people in the Likud who are a little more enlightened do, but the other three parties don't at all.
Other comments on those two questions, if there are? Shirley?
The one thing I'd like to say is that Israel is a very small country, and the population density is extremely high. It's one of the most dense countries in the world. And it's no more about integrating anyone or separating states. They are just living together very closely. And the question is, how do you live together? That's what they're learning to do. And that's what is happening day to day. And what I foresee in the future is that they're going to have to learn, and this is happening, how to make this work without killing each other and without having to leave the country, which we don't know at this point how that is going to get. But the Blinken visited, and it's very obvious that there is a huge fear that in the coming Ramadan, there are going to be huge clashes. And if you don't know, today there were rockets from Gaza. There's huge violence anticipated, and hopefully it won't happen.
Renan, would you like to add any comment on the Palestinian-Israeli connection?
No.
Okay.
I'm here to talk about public opinion.
Okay.
So, especially Israeli public opinion. So I'm going to just focus on that. Thanks.
Prudent, I imagine. There's a question at a sort of very large geopolitical scale, which is how does the situation in Ukraine affect the popularity and policies of the Netanyahu government? Any takers on that?
That is a great question, and I don't think I have any data on it.
So things are changing as we speak. Israel was extremely careful, except for Bennett in the past government trying to be the one who is trying to help Putin and Zelensky make peace. Obviously, he failed. Israel was very careful not to antagonize Russia. But just as of today, and I wasn't even able to read that much, Israel is moving towards helping Ukraine in a more active way, not just with establishing aid, kind of medical aid and all other kind of aid, but for some reason, and I believe it's under US duress, to help Ukraine more strategically with some weapons even. So we'll see. It's not announced. It's not clear yet, but we'll see what happens.
The next question relates to the very large demonstrations we've seen recently in Israel against some of the policy initiatives and projected steps of the new government. A question, what do you make of those protests and what impact could they have? Shirley, I think you are wanting to
Okay.
begin, and then we'll go to Sid.
Okay. So I've attended them because you can watch them live and you can be there. And they are not just some protests. This is absolutely huge. And by the way, more and more Likud people who are not the partners of Netanyahu that are extreme on the right, but we're talking about Likud people are quietly and less quietly starting to join, even some protests. The protests will continue every week. They are in most of the country now. And basically, they are reflecting a huge fear. It's not only the protest, but there are many sectors of Israeli industry, banks, the entire startup nation is saying stop it. And there's incredible turmoil in Israel right now over the situation. The government is already backpedaling a little bit. They were going to close the public, like the CBC, they were going to close that, and now they announced they won't. They shut down programs that were basically heritage, but not religious on the weekend. And now they're going back. So, and now they're saying, okay, maybe it's not going to be 67. Maybe we're going to bring up the threshold, and maybe we're going to bring up. So very little movement back, but definitely some movement. And it depends if the protests are going to continue, get stronger. My prediction is that they are going to be definitely steady based on a protest against Netanyahu for years, calling him prime minister. So I don't think that's going to stop. It's going to be quite strong.
Sid?
Yeah, I'll just add that this is an artifact of what Renan pointed out, that there are 25 to 30% of the Israeli population who absolutely hate Netanyahu and everything he stands for. And that's who's going to these protests. But they don't vote for him anyways, and he knows they're not going to vote for him anyways. So I heard a government minister quoted, I read it today, but it might have been a few days ago, there's an Israeli saying, Kelev novech v'shayara overet, the dog barks and the caravan passes by, meaning, yeah, let them scream. But, Shirley is right. The government will probably moderate the reform somewhat to throw these people a bone and so see we're somewhat responsive. But this legislation is going to pass in some form or another because all the parties are very committed to it, and it would be a huge embarrassment for them to back down. And his coalition partners are committed to it. It's not just Netanyahu. They want it more than him because they have their own reasons for wanting the Supreme Court to be weak.
Renan?
Sid quoted me. I can retire.
Okay, thank you for that, and we move on. I'm looking at the questions that have come in, and we do have room for some more. So if you've got to everyone on screen, if you've got questions, please do add them. So one question is, does the tides appearing to turn so strongly against a two-state solution, does this herald the arrival of a one-state solution? Sid?
Well, I thought Renan would jump in because it's a public opinion question. I also read the same poll where I read that 40% of Palestinians support armed struggle. I read that only 20% support of Jews support a one-state solution, a one democratic state solution, which is, I think, what we mean when we say one democratic state. More 34% of Jews support a one Jewish state solution where Palestinians have no rights. So I don't think it heralds a one-state solution. I think it heralds a bad stalemate for, a long time. I don't know how you get out of the mess exactly in the short run. I mean, in the long run, who knows what happens, but.
Renan?
Yeah, so from a public opinion standpoint, as I briefly noted in my presentation, Israelis are really cynical right now. So it's not really a question, and we're at a point right now where I think all of us presenting would probably agree that this question of like one state versus two state solution, I mean, especially when you get into the weeds, as Sid just did on some of the specifics of one state, I'm not convinced that because there isn't sort of a tangible proposal on the table, similar to what we saw in like the decade after the Oslo Agreement, right? Where it was like, are you in favor of this process? Are you in favor of this continuation? The absence of that tangible proposal, I think, makes questions about, well, what do you support as an Israeli, pretty abstract. And the more abstract the question it is, the less reliable it is that you're going to get, less reliable the answers that you're going to get, because people are just going to have to come up on the spot. What is reliable in terms of consistency is this sense that the Israelis are quite cynical these days. This has really tremendously led to the decline in the left, right? A lot of people that my fellow panelists talked about that used to describe themselves on the left, whether they're in Haifa or elsewhere, voting for parties that describe themselves in the center. And one of the big dynamics of that shift is not necessarily that they no longer support peace. It's a continuing growing sense of cynicism that peace is not quite around the corner. And if it's not quite around the corner, I think as Sydney aptly described, they're not particularly favoring the, well, let's go run around and try to give peace if there doesn't seem to be movement towards this permanent agreement. And so that I think is, to me, the important thing is that the cynicism that what we clearly saw with the issues 30 years on with Oslo, 20 years on with Oslo, is a lack of trust, right? The trust isn't there right now. Both sides, both Israelis and Palestinians, in terms of public opinion, tend to think the worst of each other, or significant minorities think the worst of each other and their ambitions. And so there isn't a lot of common ground. There isn't a lot of, well, where we tend to get, and then that's reflected in this cynicism by the Israelis. And so the simple answer to this question of, well, if we're kind of giving up on two-state, and most Israelis still are not quite ready to give up, they just don't see it ready to happen. The simple answer is no, they're not ready to jump onto some version of the one state that has long been talked about, and there's all sorts of flavors of it. And as long as it continues to be sort of an abstract idea, you're going to get some unreliable survey responses.
Shirley.
So let me tell you, and I'm quite clear and adamant about this, and I think it's important for the people, for the Jewish people in Israel and here to understand, because what's important is the truth. When you say two-state solution and you mean creating a border, we're talking physical, between pre-67, however you want to look at it, and the West Bank, that is dead and doesn't exist. You can't go to find a solution if you are kidding yourself about the reality on the ground. So people have taken care between 67 and today that this is impossible to do on the ground, because you cannot evacuate settlers anymore. You cannot create another expulsion of Palestinians. So it's geography. It's dead. When people talk about the two-state solution, I only accept it in the terms of describing this idea that you have two entities here. You have a Palestinian entity and you have a Jewish entity. And there will be that there forever, hopefully. But how it will happen and how they will live together, it's something that I hope to see in my life. there is a new party. Doesn't matter if you call it one party or whatever you call it. It's called Kol Ezrachea. The vote, and things happen quickly. You would not have believed 5 years ago that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are going to dictate what's happening in the country. You couldn't have predicted that there was going to be an Arab party so important in the Israeli government. And I'm taking here the risk of saying that in the next 10 years from now, we're going to look back at tonight and wonder, what were we looking at versus the new reality? And it doesn't matter what you call it. It probably is not going to be called a two-state solution. And it's not going to be called one-state solution. And it doesn't matter what it will be called, but it will be coexistence in some fashion. And I have a zillion stories to tell you because I follow, and that's why I'm optimistic, because there's a lot happening towards that.
Shirley, thank you for that very impassioned set of points you made, and also very, very, very hopeful points you made. I am mindful of the time. I can tell all participants, all viewers, that our presenters agreed to going into a bit of overtime tonight. So I can say that we will go no more than an additional, at the outside, 15 minutes, hopefully 10 minutes. So that's the time frame that I think we have left, and I think we have very interesting questions that will get us to that end point. A number of questions cluster around the judicial reforms. One comment in the chat is Israel seems to be emulating the trajectory of other theocratic states. Are the planned reforms to the judiciary a first step in moving towards a theocratic state with more to come? So that's one related question. Another is there maybe some justification in reforming the judiciary, given the understanding of the questioner that judges are appointed by other judges, not in a political oversight process? So I'll leave that out there for you to consider. And there's a lot that could be said about the relationship between our charter and notwithstanding clause and what may be moving forward in Israel. If anybody would like to comment on, is it useful to use analogies to the charter and the notwithstanding clause in thinking about where this current government seems to want to go on the judicial front? So a lot of questions there. Again, given the time, I'll ask each of you to be brief. Pick any of those questions you'd like to take on. Who would like to go first? Shirley, thank you.
So I really did a lot of work on this, and I follow very closely. Judges don't elect judges in Israel. I did mention there's a formula. There's a small number of judges. There are members of the government, members of the opposition, members from the bar. There's a fair formula that seems to be working. It was amended a few years ago. The idea now is the government to fully appoint judges. I don't think that's going to happen. It's going to be changed, and there are going to be others, because it's just not acceptable to anyone. It's kind of a starting point. The other questions were about comparison. So what Yariv Levine did in his 20 years of work getting ready to this moment, he cherry-picked. But what he cherry-picked, for example, the notwithstanding clause turning into the overriding clause, is not acceptable generally, because Israel does not have a constitution and does not have three branches like in the US. So there's a lot of attack on these proposals because of the cherry picking and saying that you can't compare apples and oranges. What was the third one? I'm trying to think. Is there justification to, is the judiciary too powerful? This is ironic because Israel used the judiciary in a big way to ensure that its army people are not taken to Hague, and to say we have a strong judiciary. Sometimes it doesn't allow to dismantle Arab places, and that is a bulwark to really a safeguard for the Israeli army people, so they are not under sanctions. And the judiciary actually did this at the request of the state. Like Netanyahu was very much supporting this judiciary for many, many years, until now, because it was good for Israel. It is not good now because it wants now to put him in his place. Formerly, there was a president in jail. There was another prime minister in jail, and at that time, it was different. So it will change. Maybe there will be some changes, but in effect, the Israeli judiciary is doing very well, in my opinion, and most Israelis' opinions.
Renan? Any comments on any of those aspects related to the judiciary?
I've looked at actually some of the public opinion data on this in both countries. And so all I'll say is that Myer and I will often, along with several of our other political science colleagues who all go to Darkly Nawab, and legal colleagues, will have these conversations about some abstract principles, which I will admit I am absolutely not an expert on, since I mainly focus on US politics when I'm not talking about Israeli elections. But in general, when it comes to opinions, I mean, an Israeli one, it's particularly clear, and to some extent this is also reflected in Canada, is that people tend to have opinions towards particular outcomes, and not so much towards the pathways to those outcomes. And so the more that they have, so it breaks down in partisan fashion, because it's like, well, and over the last 10 years, the right has really gone after the judiciary, much like it has in the US, to some extent like it has here in Canada. And so there has been this growing hostility towards liberal activist judges. And it's not necessarily that they are great, from what I can tell from public opinion, that they're turning their backs on democracy. It's just, they have a particular set of outcomes, and they want judges who agree with them. And as long as there's judges who agree with them, they're okay with judges. If the judges aren't agreeing with them, then down with the judges.
Thank you for that. And I want to squeeze in a couple of more questions. So Sid, if you've got a thought on this, I'll ask you. Thank you for taking a pass. This may, well, I'll just state it. Is there any chance that a scenario unfolds whereby Netanyahu invites a centrist party into a coalition government to offset some of the extreme right and religious? Renan?
Yes, I think Netanyahu would be quite happy to invite some in, right? I mean, I described at the end of my talk the scenario where Itamar Ben-Gvir is continuing to run around wherever there's violence to, sort of brandish a handgun and pretend that he's a Mr. Tough Guy. If he governs like he has been an attention-seeking activist, then I think Netanyahu, given that he's concerned about that narrow slice that isn't protesting, but that narrow slice will start to get very upset if Itamar Ben-Gvir is taking Israeli politics off the rails. And I think Netanyahu is going to be very sensitive to that. And he will look to parties on the center to see if he can get some support.
I'm gonna cut you off there, knowing
you
what's still to be said, and no more than a single paragraph and a short paragraph reply from both Sid and Shirley, who want in on this. Sid.
So I will say that there's no chance of him doing that unless he is exonerated in the court first. As soon as he's exonerated in the court, he will if possible, try to get rid of these partners and get some centrist partners. But the people who might join him are absolutely opposed to him because he's corrupt. So he has to get out of that bag first. And that's all I'll say about that.
Shirley, briefly.
So Netanyahu would love to get all the others. He's been begging all of them. These were the last people that were willing to go with him. Nobody else would be ready to go with him with any other party, no matter what. Because Netanyahu, they were all working for Netanyahu as ministers, and Netanyahu treated them all in the worst way possible. And now he's treating the same way, actually, Smotrich. I'm not going to go into examples, but they're amazing examples. And he's burning the last sector in the Israeli population that he could have work with him. People do not want to work with Netanyahu, but he has the Likud party. That's what he has.
Thank you,
And
Shirley.
he might lose, when he loses the Likud, that's it.
Two last questions. Is Israel headed towards a theocratic state? Sid.
No, not in the short run. In the long run, I don't know, but the demographics would have to shift considerably. So, 20, 30 years down the road, I don't know. But the religious parties today have 25% of the seats in the Knesset. That will probably grow over time, but if it was up to them, yes. But Likud is still a secular party. If you ban soccer games on Shabbat, half the Likud voters would be in the streets, demonstrating. So
I'm moving on to a next question. The Abraham Accords. Where do they stand, and is there a prospect of moving to bring the Saudis into the arrangement? Sid, I think, is saying, who knows?
about the Saudis, who knows? I don't know. But I will say one thing about the Abraham Accords. It's another nail in the coffin of a two-state solution, because once upon a time, you said, oh, well, if we settle with the Palestinians, we'll get peace with the entire Middle East. Well, if you can get peace with the entire Middle East without settling with the Palestinians, it's one less incentive to do that.
And the last question.
Oh, I was going to respond to that, and that the key factor is Iran. Thank you.
Sorry, Renan. Yeah.
I was going to add the key factor is Iran with all that. And that plays a role too with Ukraine, the extent to which the new axis of whatever you want to call it is Iran and Russia. That's going to put Saudis and others more and more in opposition to Iran, and enemy of my enemy is your friend. And oddly, that might happen.
And we have one last question, which actually arches us to the next session that I mentioned is coming up in 4 weeks with Derek Pensler on Israel diaspora relations. And important correction, I misstated the date of that session. It is March the 2nd, a Thursday evening, 4 weeks from tonight, March the 2nd. And so the question, and let me now after that correction, remind myself what the oh my God, what that question was. What would you each 1 minute suggest that Jews in Canada can do if they wish to engage with Israel on the direction of this new government? Renan?
The one sentence answer is whatever engagement you do needs to be focused on this center right block. And it needs to be done in a way where they don't feel threatened, where they don't feel like you're, pushing them around from a, perch of privilege.
What I said there was what my lips voiced was interesting comment, Renan. Thank you for that. Shirley?
So I think that the most important thing that we can do here is educate ourselves about what happens, because we don't know. We really read some newspapers, some stuff, but I think that we do not really understand life in Israel. So learn as much as possible. And after that, we may think. In my opinion, the interest of the diaspora in Israel diverge. We are interested in basically Jews having equal rights, because when there are laws of equal rights, we feel as a minority as being safe. And because in Israel right now, that's not the outlook towards equal rights, is towards overriding rights. We are going in separate directions. And I'm really looking forward to Derek speaking about these relationships and telling us what's happening, because I see us not going in the same path, but going separately.
Thank you, Shirley. And now Sydney, final word from the panel goes to you.
That's very difficult because I don't know what's really going to change things on the ground. But I think if we want to have any integrity, we have to worry about ourselves, what our own positions are, what messages we're sending to our own children, how it will affect the future of Judaism in Canada and in North America and the diaspora. I don't see backing a extreme right, illiberal, I can't think of a better word, racist government. I'm sorry to use such harsh words. It does anything except hurt the Jewish community here in Canada. And I think it's immoral. So my advice would be to disengage completely from the Israeli government, this Israeli government, and to work with parties in Israel, a minority, who support liberal, left, tolerant viewpoints that I agree with, and I hope that most of us agree with. So there are no lack of such organizations. They're small, they're weak, but that's who you should be engaging with and supporting.
Thank you, Sydney, and a huge thanks to Renan and to Shirley as well. There have been some tough questions, and Shirley, you mentioned the importance of educating ourselves and expanding our knowledge of Israel, and boy, have the three of you accomplished that for us tonight. I think I could speak for everyone in saying we know a lot more about the current state and likely go forward prospects of Israeli politics now at 8:45 than we did at 7 o'clock this evening. So really, for your knowledge and for your courage in addressing some pretty tough, tricky questions and issues, I thank you, and I'm sure that everyone on screen is very grateful and appreciative. I will simply close by thanking again Judy Howard, who made all of this possible and bailed me out several times this evening. And I was remiss in not mentioning that this program and future ones in this series are organized by the Israel Engagement Committee of the Shul. And a special shout out to Mayor Bester, who did a lot of the heavy lifting in planning and organizing this. I hope that all of you will be back, and there'll be ongoing shul promotion of the session on March 2nd with Derek Pensler. And good evening, gute Nacht, best to all, and thank you so much for being with us for what was a longer session than we thought it would be, but that was because of so many good questions and interesting comments from our presenters. So perhaps a show of applause for our presenters who really were very thoughtful and interesting, and best to everyone, and a good night.